All right, so we are looking at day 2 here. This is going to be digestive system physiology. So we're going to, this is kind of just to mention a little bit of like catabolic stuff that's going to take place, right? Yesterday we talked about the differences between anabolism and catabolism. Today we're going to kind of talk about like how we get all the ingredients catabolically to do stuff. So your digestive system is a really big part of your overall physiology, right? When it comes to energy production, you have to be able to like break food down. So we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit. Now, like I said, we're actually going to move through this relatively quickly because we're going to go much more in depth with the digestive system in our actual nutrition class. But we're going to get a good chunk of it out of the way today, just to kind of give you a little bit of foundational knowledge. So we need to be able to kind of identify the organs of the digestive system. That's really our main task today. And then what each of those organs do, so physiologically. Understand the anatomy of like the stomach, understand the different roles of what is entailed when it comes to digestion versus absorption, because those are two different concepts that sometimes people just sort of lump all into one big thing. And then, oh my gosh. And then we'll also talk a little bit about like the pancreas, the major functions of your liver, your large intestine, small intestine as well, and then specific nutrients. So as we're looking at it, right, when we look at like what digestion is, right, is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of foods and the absorptions of nutrients. We call that whole process digestion, but that's not actually a very great definition. That's more like the definition of your digestive system, which we call the digestive system, but your digestive system is responsible for digestion and absorption, right? Like this is all talking about the mechanical and chemical breakdown of stuff. The absorption part of it is the other task that your digestive system does. So there is a difference between digestion and absorption, and we do want to keep those concepts separate because you've got organs that are digesting things and you got organs that are absorbing things, right? Like your stomach does not actually, its job is just to break stuff down, but your small intestine's job is to get stuff from your digestive system into your bloodstream. So there is kind of a difference there. So if we talk about like, I'm going to kind of redefine the overview here in just a little bit. But the major divisions that you got, the major sections that we're going to be talking about today are what are called your alimentary canal. That's technically like the tube that's traveling from like all the way from like your mouth to the exit down below, right? That is your entire alimentary canal. And all of the accessory organs. So like the alimentary canal becomes your stomach, it opens up and then it closes down, becomes your small intestine, and then travels around and then opens up a little bit further and becomes your large intestine. And that is sort of like the end of the whole system there. And then there's all these little accessory organs that are kind of excreting this stuff like into the system to allow stuff to further break down. So that's kind of what that's really what we're discussing today. So here you can kind of see actually, this is the entire alimentary canal from start to finish, right? And so it'll go through the mouth and then it becomes the stomach and then it becomes the small intestine, then it becomes the large intestine, and then it makes the exit. Here's all the big major steps here, right? You've got ingestion first, which is really just like getting food into your body. So we'll talk just a little bit about that. Then we've got propulsion. Propulsion is just a really cool thing that your digestive system can do. Your digestive system, your alimentary canal, it is fairly muscular. I mean, it's made of what is called smooth muscle, which is like your skeletal muscle, except that it doesn't have like the big striations. So it's not able to make really big contractions. It's able to make really weak ones, but it's able to do it fairly consistently, and it's able to, it's lined with more stretch receptors than you would find in like a lot of other tissue. And so that's how actually food's able to kind of move in the direction it needs to go. Like if you were to, if I were to like lay on my bed with my feet on my bed and like my head on the floor and I were to eat something, it would still travel in the right direction, thanks to my digestive system's propulsion ability, right? Like it can still travel upwards against gravity. And that's a really good thing. And it basically does that by just like making these little tiny squeezy contractions to move things through. Now, there is also a little bit of a difference between what we call mechanical processing, which is things like chewing, or even just in your stomach, there's like little folds that can actually move stuff around. That's the churning sensation that you sometimes hear in your stomach, by the way, where you're like, you know, that's basically these little folds inside of your stomach making these little contractions. That's a little bit of like mechanical work, right? So that's mechanical processing. And then we have like chemical processing, which is much more commonly known as digestion. So like letting stuff sit in this super acidic material, or letting it sit in like a bunch of enzymes or hormones or things like that, right? That is the process of digestion, right? That's those materials. And so, you know, you have to be able to like get those hormones or get those enzymes like into the system, and so you have secretion ability. And then the really key reason we're even doing all this, the reason we're breaking everything down through mechanical processing, digestion, and then, you know, secretions allowing that to happen, is so that we can actually absorb those nutrients. And absorption is the, you know, kind of crux of what we're talking about today. It's all about getting nutrients so small that they are able to actually pass into our bloodstream. And then finally, you have excretion, which is getting any leftovers out of the body. Oy. Oh, don't do another one. Ah. God. Okay. So that's kind of the whole, that's the reasoning behind understanding our digestive system, because we need to kind of understand all of those processes. So I'm going to go actually back to the top here and get us like a top definition here. So we're looking at the digestive system. It is going to be the system in the body responsible for the mechanical and chemical breakdown of foods and the absorption of nutrients by the body's cells. That's a much better definition than just calling that digestion, right? So there are a lot of examples of like what's going on here, right? We are going to see ingestion, followed by ingestion, propulsion, mechanical processing, digestion, secretion, absorption, and excretion. Gonna get gross today. We're talking about excretion. We're gonna keep it relatively short though. So first thing we need to understand, we need to talk about what is called your alimentary canal, which I already mentioned, but that is basically an 8-meter long, which, by the way, 8 meters, that is way larger than I've even got in my room here, I think. Or maybe it's about the length, but that's a pretty long freaking, like, that's a pretty good length, right? And that is actually what's traveling all the way like through you, but it folds up a whole bunch when it gets to like the intestines. So that is your alimentary canal. It's an 8-meter long muscular tube passing through the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. So it is going to pass all the way. It's actually going to travel through your diaphragm. So when you look at your diaphragm, if you take a look at it, you'll actually see, oh, that's kind of interesting. They're only showing, there we go. You can actually see it's got a hole in the center of it, actually. And so you can see there, that's where your aorta is going to pass through. So this is where blood vessels pass through. And then take a look over here. This is another one of your holes, right? That's actually running through this. There's where your veins travel up. So this is traveling down through your diaphragm. This is traveling up from your diaphragm. And then you've got your esophagus here. And that is actually like where your digestive system passes through. And this is kind of that you know, big dome-shaped muscle that flattens down to allow air to travel into your lungs, and then it presses back up when it relaxes to push air out of your lungs. and we'll be looking at that, in our respiratory system. But your alimentary canal actually travels through it. So, and that's going to go all the way from start to finish. So here's kind of an interesting chart showing you the alimentary canal in a nutshell, right? So and it's going to start here at your mouth, and then see you've got like salivary glands that are like excreting saliva into the beginning section here, right? That is your first accessory organ. So you've got all these little glands. You've got some up here, you've got some underneath your tongue, and those are your salivary glands. They excrete your saliva, which is not just like water. Like a lot of times, like we kind of think it's like spit being pretty much just water, and for the most part it is like it's mostly water, but it has a lot of other materials in it as well. For instance, it has these little proteins in it called salivary amylase, and salivary amylase actually is going to be present in your mouth, and that starts chemically breaking down food. I actually like to do, normally we do this kind of interesting experiment in our nutrition class where I go and pick up some like saltines, and everybody takes one. And this is gross, by the way, but it is something we do for fun. You eat the saltine, you chew it up, and then you're not allowed to swallow it. You just kind of have to keep chewing and just kind of hanging out. And we do it for like a full 1 minute period. And what's weird is like a saltine is like very stale, kind of salty. But it's made of carbohydrates, right? It's made of complex carbohydrates. And then eventually, what's interesting, the more you chew it, it starts to taste almost a little sweet. Like it's not going to be as sugary as like Cocoa Puffs, but it starts to taste like a little sweet. And that's because what your salivary amylase does is it actually breaks up complex carbohydrates into sugars. So in that process of hydrolysis that we mentioned, those enzymes kind of kick hydrolysis off. And so it's a very wet, watery environment. And so water molecules are splitting up this big, long chain of carbohydrates into little tiny carbohydrates, little 2 sugar molecules. But it can't get all the way down to glucose. And that's where the rest of your digestive system starts coming in later. So that's your first accessory organ. Then it's going to continue traveling down the canal here where, it's going to hang out in your stomach as long as it needs to. So this is actually used for a little bit of storage because your small intestine can only take so much food at a time. So it does have a little bit of storage that's going to take place there. But as soon as like it is ready for the actual absorption process, little bits are going to kind of move, small pieces at a time into your small intestine. So your stomach is primarily responsible for digestion. There's a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to digesting things. And there is a whole bunch of this material called hydrochloric acid in your stomach. And hydrochloric acid is it is extremely acidic. Like when you think of acid, we always think of like sci-fi movies and it's like somebody like, and they like melt, that's not actually a bad, that's actually not a very bad interpretation of like what acids are. Acids are very good at like dissolving things. Well, you create hydrochloric acid in your stomach. This is actually why, and this is going to sound kind of surprising, but chlorine is actually an essential nutrient. Sounds kind of weird. I am not telling you to go drink bleach. That is not the same thing. I have a joke I want to make, but I can't. I'll get fired. So, I don't want to end up in the news like somebody else who tells people to do questionable things with bleach. There we go. Anyway, so you do have like a little bit of digestion that's going to take place here thanks to that acid, thanks to that hydrochloric acid. And hydrochloric acid is actually so acidic. Here's what's weird. If you were to take hydrochloric acid out of your stomach and pour it onto your arm, it would actually dissolve. It would give you a chemical burn on your arm. It would start dissolving your arm. And so it's like, well, how the heck do we have this stuff in our stomach? How does it not like eat all the way through us, right? Like, how is it not like an alien movie where it's just like coming all the way through to the other side? Well, luckily your stomach also creates something called mucus, and mucus is extremely base. It's like on the exact opposite side of the pH scale. So you have acids and you have bases, right? And that mucus cancels out that hydrochloric acid. Now, sometimes you could lose your mucus lining. Sometimes like Sometimes it happens through poor diet. Sometimes you just create so much acid that it breaks through, and you can actually damage your mucus lining. And then when you don't have that, that acid starts dissolving whatever it gets its hands on, and that's actually how you end up with an ulcer. If anybody knows anybody who has an ulcer, um, and that's actually why. It's also why, like, if you've ever like vomited, that's why it's very burn. It has a very burny sensation as it's like coming out the other end, coming out, right? So that's your stomach in a nutshell. We'll kind of go through that in a little bit. Then you have another accessory organ, which is your pancreas, and it's right here where your small intestine is meeting with your stomach. And so your pancreas here, it's also responsible for like excreting some enzymes right into the beginning of your small intestine. So it creates this thing. Remember, we were talking about salivary amylase. Your pancreas creates something called pancreatic amylase. And this is going to further break down any carbohydrates that have not been busted up yet. And so, like, this is also going to help with that process as well. But so we've really been talking about, like, salivary glands are breaking stuff down. Your mouth is chewing, that's breaking stuff down. The stomach, that's breaking stuff down. Your pancreas, that's helping break stuff down. A little bit further, you've also got your liver here. Your liver, which is responsible for detoxing your whole body. It's one of the most important organs in your entire body. Not only is this responsible for creating what is called bile, which is what's going to help you break down fats, but it's also where you store a whole bunch of your glycogen. It's responsible for detoxifying a lot of materials inside of your body. So like all of your blood vessels actually run through your liver, and that's where they are either picking up materials that shouldn't really be there and being destroyed and detoxified so that they can get carried to your kidneys and eventually carried to your bladder and exit out of the body. But also, like, this is responsible for like destroying any of your old red blood cells. In one of my favorite actual terms, like in the world of physiology, one of my favorite terms of all time, in your liver, old red blood cells, once they're too old and they can't function anymore, they go to the liver to die. And they go to this place called the red blood cell graveyard. And that is the actual scientific name, which is the most awesome thing ever. The red blood cell graveyard. Anyway, once it gets all broken down, it's a bunch of pieces, which can then go back to be made into new red blood cells. So it's more of a recycling center more than a graveyard. But that's not nearly as cool sounding. Red blood cell graveyard was the name of my death metal band in high school. So in your liver, that's your liver there. Now, once it in terms of the digestive part of things, it makes this material called bile. And bile is what helps break down fats. So what's interesting is, like, until now, fats have kind of remained unbroken up. They don't really break down thanks to hydrochloric acid. They don't really break down thanks to salivary amylase, but they do break down in response to bile. You can think of bile as like dish soap. Like, think about the last time you made something with like ground beef or something and it had like, there's a whole bunch of grease left over in the pan. If you run water onto that pan, like, nothing happens, right? But the minute you pour just a little bit of dish soap, it immediately breaks it all up and it comes right off, right? That's because dish soap acts as what's called an emulsifier. And so an emulsifier is basically what helps you break down fats. And that's what bile does, which is created by your liver, and then it's stored in your gallbladder. So your body always wants to have like a little bit of a backup when it comes to bile production. So it will store it in your gallbladder, and your gallbladder is actually what drops it off into your small intestine. So the gallbladder doesn't make bile, but it does hold on to it. What's up, Armin? Oop.
How's it going?
It's going, man. Good to see you.
Likewise.
So that's your gallbladder, right? It's gonna store onto that. This is also why your gallbladder can be removed. For instance, my mom had to have her gallbladder removed because she got like a gallstone the size of a freaking golf ball. It wouldn't have been the size of a golf ball. She just didn't go to the doctor as early as I told her to. Anyway, he said, not bitter at all. So, you can remove your gallbladder and basically they'll just connect a tube directly from your liver right into your small intestine. So small intestine is then going to continue absorbing nutrients, which you can see really large section, right? Like this is pretty large. So this is going to absorb, this is going to give you plenty of time to absorb all those nutrients that we've broken down, right? So we had food, it got broken down, it got further broken down, it got further broken down. Now it's this wet, soupy mixture of nothing but individual chemicals, and those chemicals can now be absorbed into your bloodstream. And then it's going to pass into your large intestine, which is actually way shorter, which you can kind of see in this picture here. But it's called the large intestine because it's much wider and it's much more muscular. And so what's happening here is this is actually going to be the last part of digestion. If anything didn't get picked up in your small intestine, your large intestine can absorb a few nutrients here, but primarily its job is to absorb water. So this is where you're really going to bring a whole bunch of water into your system. And it's going to actually dehydrate all of that wet, soupy mixture from before. So like imagine food, and it gets broken down into this wet, soupy goo, right? And then once it gets to here, all of that water is going to get pulled out of it and absorbed by your small intestine. That's going to kind of dehydrate all of that bile, which eventually gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it becomes your stool, right? So that's, and then eventually it makes like a nice exit. So that is kind of your digestive system in a nutshell. Now we kind of need to just break it down a little more specifically so that we understand each of these individual processes. So first thing we are talking about here, and this is what's interesting about this PowerPoint. This PowerPoint is going to kind of bounce around just a little bit because it's going to go through ingestion, which we'll talk a little bit about like what organs do that. So you're probably going to see me put a little bit of notes in just because I like to put the notes in kind of a sequential order. But you might notice that like I put some stuff in that's not in the slides at the beginning, and then you'll see them later on. For instance, like we've already talked about the alimentary canal, even though we're not necessarily there yet. So let's go ahead and look at the process of digestion, right? So digestion, and actually I'm going to put each of these definitions here. So digestion is the process by which the body breaks down nutrients into their individual components, right? And it's going to do this through like physical processing. It does this through physical or mechanical processing, such as chewing. Oh, whoops, hold on. I put my parentheses in the wrong place. Such as chewing or, you know, folding things around like in your stomach in order to break down food. But it also does it through, so some of it's physical, right? Like chewing is a really good example of a physical processing. That is the process of digestion. And then you've also got chemical breakdown, right? And chemical processing, such as the acid, the stomach acid, breaking down food, right? So those are kind of the two ways that you are processing. Those are kind of the two ways that you're breaking down nutrients. So we kind of have to understand, like, why the heck are we breaking this stuff down so small, right? Why are we breaking down this food so much? Well, we got to remember, we are trying to get this into our bloodstream. And it's going to be, you know, we need these nutrients to be carried by blood cells, which are some of the smallest cells that you have got in your entire body. So here's what's kind of interesting about like the process of digestion and the process of absorption. Now you got to stay with me on this because this sounds really weird when I describe it this way, but this is actually something that we kind of need to understand. So your stomach, your alimentary canal, your stomach, your small intestine, all of that stuff is technically on the outside of your body. Now, I know that sounds really weird. Like, I know that it's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, if it's on the outside of my body, like, you know, I should be able to touch it. But you got to remember, you are actually, when it comes to like looking at this whole system, you are actually kind of a human donut. And what I mean by like you're a human donut is the fact that like you have the outside of the donut and then it's a ring and it goes like this, and then there's the inside of like the donut hole, but that's still part of the outside environment. It isn't until you break the donut in half and expose the actual inner part that's the inside of the donut. The hole is not. You are an uninterrupted donut. Like your mouth is the start of your alimentary canal, and it is an uninterrupted hole from start to finish. Now there's a few flaps that like close over it and stuff, but like your digestive system is technically the outside of your body. And I know that seems really odd, but it is. It is. So how the heck do we get something to simply pass from the outside of our body to the inside of our body? You know, like how do we get something like if I wanted to like absorb a donut, right? Let's say I want to like eat a donut and I want to get all those nutrients into my bloodstream. I can't just take that donut and mash it through my skin, right? Like it doesn't work that way. But if I chew it up and it gets broken down smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually it will become just all of its individual chemicals. It'll just be all of the chemicals that used to come together to make up that whole donut. Now they're just all individual chemicals. And those chemicals are so small that they are literally able to simply pass from one side to the other. They are able to pass straight into your bloodstream. That's where your small intestine comes in. Your small intestine is basically a bunch of really tiny holes that nutrients can fit through, right? And that's how we get stuff into our bloodstream. That's why digestion is so important to understand clearly. This is where, and I don't want to like get all controversial or you know, super opinionated about things here. But I always invite discussion if you do want to talk about this. But this is why like cleansing doesn't really do what people think that it does. Like I know so many people who have, you know, purchased these cleanses and this stuff from like these companies that, you know, it's like you sign up for it and then you sign up your friends and you know, you know, there's a lot of like cleansing stuff out there, or they'll buy a cleanse from like the internet or something, and it's like I get a lot of questions. They're like, hey, like, is this cleanse any good? And I always kind of have the same approach when I ask people, like, well, what do you want it to do? Like, what's your goal with the cleanse? Like, is it to like increase your uptake of like vitamins and minerals? Because if you're doing a juice cleanse, that's actually not a bad way to get a whole bunch of vitamins and minerals in your life, you know, like those juices are full of nutrients, so that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. But like, are you imagining that this juice that you're drinking is going to go into your body, grab evil materials and then pull them out of the other end? Because like that is not how your digestive system works, right? This is also why when you look at like the process of digestion, this is also why most like steroids don't really do anything if they are the ingestible type. They can't make it to your bloodstream because if you take a pill, your stomach acid destroys it. And it just becomes, you know, it's made of protein, so it'll be like eating a very small piece of steak. You know, eventually it just all becomes the same ingredients. Now, they've gotten a little better nowadays. There's, unfortunately, God dang it, they have been continually pushing that technology, and they are getting to a place where that stuff has started to survive your stomach acid, which is a freaking bummer if you ask me, because Lord knows we don't need more of that stuff in the world. So that's not exactly the rule that it used to be. But that's, so when you think about like what a cleanse is, like it doesn't really make sense when you start to understand how the process of actual digestion and absorption take place. You're turning everything into chemicals, you know? And so then those chemicals are absorbed by your small intestine. So digestion is going to break things down into, you know, a beyond microscopic level. I mean, it's going to break them down into individual chemicals. So digestion will actually begin in your mouth. The first part of digestion is right in the mouth when you start taking solid food particles and chewing them up and mixing them with your saliva. So like the minute you start chewing stuff, you are doing that mechanical processing and it's starting to break things down, right? And the reason we do that is because, again, we are trying to get things smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually they're microscopic, right? And that's why chewing your food is so important, because if you don't chew your food, what ends up happening is it goes to your stomach in a very large chunk. Now your stomach's really acidic, so it can just sit in your stomach for a longer period of time, and eventually it can get broken down. But it takes a lot longer to get that done, and so there's definitely like some nutrients are being destroyed because it's sitting in your stomach for such a long period. Normally, it would get broken down pretty quickly, and then it would get into your intestine for like absorption. But when you think of like the fact that like you took a large chunk of something and then you just dipped it in acid, there's not very much surface area, right? Like if I had something this large, right, and somehow I swallowed that, right? There's plenty. It's a large object, so there's some surface area, but there's not as much surface area as if I were to break this in half, right? Because now I've got the entire outside and I've got this inner part right here, right? And if I were to break each of those in half, I would have even more surface area. So the reason you're chewing is because you're trying to increase the surface area to make digestion in your stomach easier. And then there's also in your stomach, you have your saliva. So the process of digestion that's taking place in the mouth, you've got chewing, right, which is, again, mechanical processing that increases the surface area of foods by breaking them into smaller and smaller pieces. Okay, so that's where chewing happens in the mouth. But there's also saliva, right? So there's also a little bit of chemical processing, which is thanks to this material called salivary amylase. Okay, so saliva will moisten your food and make it easier to chew, and it will also begin the process of digesting carbohydrates. So it will take big complex chains of sugars and break them into relatively simple sugars. It can't get them all the way broken down, but it can go a long way. This is, by the way, controlled by your parasympathetic nervous system. It is autonomic. In fact, actually right now, if I start talking about like, I want you guys to think of your favorite pizza, like your favorite pizza in all of LA, right? Like, I don't know where that is. Like I love like Mama and Papa's pizza, for instance. Like it's kind of greasy and salty and oh my God, it's so good, right? Like a nice pepperoni pizza. Okay, I've talked about pizza enough. Everybody should be salivating a little bit. That's kind of, I always like to use pizza as an example because it's like kind of salty, which generally makes you salivate a little more. So that is a parasympathetic thing. That's autonomic. You don't really have too much control of that. If you start thinking of like your favorite foods, you will actually start salivating. And so that is going to create that like secretion, right? So you're also going to have like saliva, which is going to be secreted by salivary glands to chemically break down carbohydrates and a little bit of lipids. Actually, we'll just say to break down nutrients, right? The really big one that we want you to know is salivary amylase. So salivary amylase is produced by the salivary glands. It is able to break complex carbohydrates into disaccharides, which are, oops, that's not how you spell disaccharides. Disaccharide, actually, how the heck, two C's? That's what it is. Break it into disaccharides to double. Okay, so salivary amylase can break down complex carbs into a 2-sugar molecule. So you got to remember that like Most carbohydrates are what we call polysaccharides. Those are big complex chains of like poly stands for many, right? So that's like 10 or more sugar molecules all linked together. And so it's this like really, 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 really large chain. Like if I look up polysaccharide, we should see, yeah, here's a really good example, right? All these individual sugar molecules all chained together, right? That's a big starch. And each of these little ones, these are each an individual little glucose molecule. So your salivary amylase is able to break that from a polysaccharide down into what's called a disaccharide. And that is what we were kind of looking at yesterday. That's a 2-sugar molecule. So it's relatively sweet, like 2 sugar molecules. You can think of like, you can find this in some types of fruits or even like the sweet parts of vegetables. That sweet taste is coming from disaccharides. It's not as simple as like a single sugar molecule, but it's pretty darn simple. Now it'll also break down, there's other nutrients in there. There's things like electrolytes can be found in there. Digestive enzymes like lingual lipase. That's actually going to be excreted by your mouth, and then it's going to travel down. That's going to further help with breaking down fats. And then there is a little bit of like protein breakdown that's going to happen there as well. And all of that's really important because that's another part of your autonomic nervous system. This is why we love food so much. You know, like we start breaking it down and your body like starts breaking down the mouth, which gives you like taste, and your body goes, oh, those things taste good. You know why you're programmed to have those things taste good? Because they're essential nutrients. Your body says, oh, that's something that I need. I'm going to make this taste good, you know, so that I can get what I need. That's why we like proteins, fats, and carbs. But if you were to like lick like the plastic wrapper on a Snickers bar, it's not going to taste like anything because it isn't a nutrient. It's stuff. It should have a taste, right? But we don't have taste buds that are able to actually taste those things. This is, I think I said this the other day, but cats can't taste glucose because they don't break down glucose for ATP production. Cats only use proteins as a source of gluconeogenesis to produce ATP. So cats cannot taste sugar. They don't know what sugar is. If you were to like put it, it would taste like plastic, or which is to say that it tastes like nothing. I know what some of you guys are thinking. It's like, well, I might not be able to taste plastic, but like, you know, I've had like that coppery metallic taste when I taste like certain metals. Well, that makes sense because iron is an essential nutrient. Copper is an essential nutrient. You can taste things that are nutrients, right? You have the tools necessary to taste the things that you need to eat. That way, you are inclined to eat those things. So we start to see again, function following form. You guys know I love to say it. All right. So then the esophagus is going to travel down through what we call the mediastinum. That's the area in your rib cage there. It'll travel through your down through your esophageal hiatus. That is through your diaphragm there. Eventually, it will get to the very bottom, the very bottom, just to before the stomach, where you'll find what is called your lower esophageal sphincter. And so like this is where your esophagus, which is really just a tube, there's no digestion that's taking place there, is going to officially meet up with your stomach, okay? So it's able to do all this, by the way, like your alimentary canal, it's able to do all this and move this around thanks to this contraction called peristalsis. So peristalsis is basically these little waves. They're these little contractions that push food through your digestive system, right? The way I always like to think of it, and it really does kind of look like this, is like, you know, when you're at the end of a tube of toothpaste and you're doing like this thing where you're like squeeze, 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 like trying to get like just that last little bit of toothpaste to the end of the tube. That is kind of how your digestive system works. It actually kind of just makes these little tiny squeezes that push food throughout your body. They're these little like contractions that take place. So we call that process peristalsis, and that's how we get food to travel into our actual stomach. So here's your stomach here, and you can see all these little folds, these little waves. Those are called your rugae, and the rugae are actually these little tiny folds that are able to kind of move food around and kind of make sure that like the food that you just ate is being mixed up effectively with all that hydrochloric acid. So that is the process of ingestion. Now we're going to get a little more into digestion. But before we get to the stomach, I want to show you a video. I always show this video in class. This is the most scientist-looking scientist I have ever seen in my life. Hydrochloric acid burger. So, is this the one? Yeah, here we go. So this is a short little video that's going to show you how hydrochloric acid actually breaks down your stomach. This is the acid found that your body makes within your stomach. Yeah, Stadia. I'm never getting you. Stop trying. All right.
Fumes for now this. Here we go. Good old McDonald's cheeseburger. Still warm. It's tempted to eat it. Okay, so we're going to leave our burger to digest for a while in the acid. Come back later and see what's happened.
Unlike most of the chemicals I talk about.
Really quick. Most scientist-looking scientist you've ever seen, right? Like when you picture scientist, this face is now what you will picture. For the record though, this guy's doing a lot of videos. He's really great. Super fun dude.
Unlike most of the chemicals I talk about, I can be absolutely sure that every person watching has a sample of hydrochloric acid with them as they watch. Because hydrochloric acid is found in everybody's stomach, and it's part of our digestive process. So, as you're watching me, churning away in your stomach is hydrochloric acid, which is one of the first stages in which food is broken down into usable components to give you energy or make you fat.
It's 3.5 hours. So we're going to see what happens to a tasty McDonald's cheeseburger after 3.5 hours of concentrated hydrochloric acid. Okay. Ooh. Oh my God. I think it's absolutely disgusting. So, I mean, the fats aren't really going to dissolve very well because in your stomach, there's lots of bile acids in your actual body to do digestion. This is just pure HCl.
So that's what's kind of interesting, right? And what he's talking about there, that you can kind of see, he is kind of showing you that carbohydrates and proteins, right? Both of those things break down pretty effectively with just hydrochloric acid alone. But he mentioned at the very end there, he's like, you notice how like the cheese kind of survived, right? And then some of the protein survived as well because it's a freaking McDonald's cheeseburger. So Lord knows that's not exactly low fat. That's not exactly lean meat, right? So fat doesn't break down thanks to hydrochloric acid. You need bile salts in order for that to happen. This is just like running the water over like a greasy pan, right? It doesn't do anything without dish soap. So we're about to get into that process right here. That chewing part, right, by the way, is actually referred to specifically as what we call mastication. Mastication is this, right? It's opening and closing your mouth from, and chewing it, kind of sliding your teeth around. That's chewing. And so what ends up happening is you're going to chew up food. That food's going to mix with your saliva, and it's going to become this kind of little round ball that we're going to call a bolus. And that bolus is then going to be swallowed, and peristalsis is going to carry it to your stomach. Now, once it gets into your stomach is this kind of J-shaped organ that sits, behind a lot of your other organs, and its lining have all these little folds that I showed you just a second ago, right? Like if you look at those, these are all the little individual folds called rugae, and they are, like that burger was just kind of clipped to it was like held together with a clip, and it was just kind of held into the acid, right? And for the most part, that broke it down pretty well. But luckily, you've got all these folds inside of your stomach that are actually there, and they're kind of churning the food around, mixing it with the acid, and that makes it even more effective at breaking down food. Because that video, that was like concentrated hydrochloric acid, which is definitely more acidic than our actual stomach acid. So like, you know, our stomach acid wouldn't break down food quite as efficiently as that burger did. But thanks to things like Rugi, it kind of gets the job done just as well, because it's making sure that it's like evenly distributed. It's like when you're cooking something and you're continually turning the food to make sure that it's getting heat on all sides. So that is like in your, oh, I do have a good picture. Of course I do. It's a giant PowerPoint. So here's all the different layers of your stomach, right? So there's your esophagus. There's the little esophageal sphincter right there. That's there to make sure that like food doesn't travel back up your esophagus. That's what opens up when you throw up, you know? So luckily that's closed down for the most part. But some people, if you've ever known somebody who has like, you know, they're irritated very easily and they throw up really easily, they are usually pretty overactive in this little sphincter right here. And by the way, really quick, I think I said this earlier, but we're gonna use the term sphincter a lot. A sphincter is basically any little muscular area that can close and open up to allow things to either, you know, not pass through or pass through. So here's your pyloric sphincter, right? And it's this little hole that kind of closes in order to keep food from traveling into your small intestine before it's ready, right? We don't want it to get in here until it's already broken down. So here's all the like little rugi here. And then look at all the different layers. That's where you're gonna find like the mucosa layer and the subacute mucosa layer. That's what's creating that mucus, which cancels out the acid, and that makes sure that the stomach doesn't digest itself. The stomach's inner lining has all these like mucous membranes that have all, and they are also striated with these gastric glands, right? And those glands are going to secrete all kinds of other materials. All that kind of comes together to be like what we like to call gastric juice. Gastric juice is basically not just hydrochloric acid, but it's like things like pancreatic amylase and lingual lipase and pepsin and digestin. Pepsin is actually the material that breaks proteins down really effectively. Remember we talked about it yesterday. Proteins are big complex chains of amino acids, and they're held together with peptide bonds, right? Pepsin is the material that breaks those peptide bonds. And there's where that's mentioned actually. So the primary type of enzyme breakdown for protein, thanks to that pepsin. Lingual lipase is gonna break down a little bit of fats. There's gonna be a little bit of fat breakdown in the stomach. However, way more of it's gonna take place in the intestine. And then you're also gonna secrete what's called intrinsic factor, which is really important for breaking vitamin B12 off of some nutrients so that you can absorb it later. And that one gets its own special little enzyme there. So major digestive enzymes that we've got. So let's get the stomach here. So then we've got our stomach, right? Which is a J-shaped pouch containing several layers responsible for creating hydrochloric acid and other gastric juices. Okay, responsible for digestion. Okay, so first one I want to mention, like I said, hydrochloric acid, or HCl. And this is going to be actually, you know what? Yeah, I'm gonna open it up there. An extremely acidic material responsible for chemically breaking down food. Okay. So that's your hydrochloric acid, but you're also going to see things like pepsin, which is going to digest, aids in the digestion of proteins by breaking the peptide bonds that hold amino acids together to each other. Okay, so if your amino acids are held together with those peptide bonds, pepsin's going to break that up. And that's really like kind of the main ones. By the way, you're also going to see a few like sugar breakdowns thing here as well, like sucrase, maltase, and lactase. Each of those are different enzymes that break down sugars found in like fruits and milk proteins. You'll notice that they don't mention lactose here. Not everybody actually makes lactose. So lactose, well, sorry, not everybody makes lactase. So here's what's kind of interesting. Maggie, Armin, Nancy, are any of you guys, or Frankie, are any of you guys lactose intolerant? You have trouble
Not
telling?
me.
No? No? All right.
I am.
Are ya?
100% I am. Oh, yeah.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. So for the record, it is more common to be lactose intolerant. Not to put anybody on blast here. I am also extremely not lactose intolerant. I come from a long line of milk drinkers. Here's the thing. We're the weirdos. There are more people who are lactose intolerant than there are people who can handle drinking milk, which I did not know because I grew up in the Northwest where everybody drinks milk. But that is actually because like at some point, certain people started creating this extra enzyme in their stomach that allowed them to break down like that milk protein, but not everybody has it. And that's what makes you lactose intolerant, which is, you know, why if you ever take like Lactaid, right, which is like a pill that you can take that helps you like digest those milk proteins, it basically gives you that enzyme. So that's kind of a fun one. So that is, for the most part, that's the heavy lifting of digestion. Now, I do want to mention, now, you know, we'll do it in the next part. So we're working our way through digestion here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at absorption, because you'll notice like we're kind of going through the process, then we have like the body parts. So far we've made it to the stomach. Now let's get into the small intestine and we'll start getting into some of our accessory organs. So looking at the process of absorption. Absorption is the process of allowing chemicals to pass from the digestive system into the bloodstream. So it is the absorption of nutrients. Okay, so now we're literally letting those chemicals actually get into our body. That is absorption, right? So your small intestine is this tubular, I love this word, it's this tubular organ with many loops and coils filling much of the abdominal cavity. You guys gonna see the new Bill and Ted movie? Because I know I am. Anyway, we're back, focusing. So that's your small intestine. And basically it's gonna extend from that sphincter that we mentioned earlier, right? So you're gonna see right here, that's your pyloric sphincter. The last section of your stomach is called your pylorus. It gets a special little name because there's all these little stretch receptors, and their job is to sense whether food is actually broken down or if it's stretching too much because it's still very much in a large food form. So if it's broken down into a wet soupy mixture, it's like, great, I can absorb that. And so then the pyloric sphincter opens up. So that's going to enter into the first part of your small intestine, which is called your duodenum, or you can call it your duodenum, which is a pretty cool name. And so it'll travel into that first section of the small intestine, your duodenum. Then it'll work its way into your jejunum, which is sort of the main section of your small intestine, before eventually becoming your ileum, which is the last section of your small intestine before it becomes your large intestine. So duodenum is located in the posterior parietal part of your peritoneum, and basically this is like right up near your right kidney. Doesn't really matter. That's honestly not very important, but it's basically the mixing area where all of that wet, soupy mixture of food and nutrients and stuff is mixing with the first part of your small intestine. Okay. By the way, that wet soupy mixture is going to be referred to as chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Chyme is not quite food, but it's also not quite stool. It is the liquid stuff that food becomes. Like that burger, when it was all that wet soupy stuff, that's what chyme is. Here's kind of the sections of your small intestine laid out, by the way, and you can see like how freaking long it is. Like it's way taller than you are, you know? That's your small intestine if it were all stretched out. So then it'll become the jejunum, which is really like where a lot of absorption is taking place. Like this is really the large section here in the middle. And then there's the ileum, which is the final section where more absorption is taking place. So absorption is primarily going to take place in the small intestine, which is the primary of absorption in the body, right? Now, your small intestine, like I said, it's this big, long, kind of empty tube. It is covered head to toe in this stuff, these little tiny hair-like projections called villi, okay? So the inner wall of your small intestine has these little projections called your intestinal villi, and their job is to increase the surface area of your small intestine. So take a look, like let's just imagine, I'm gonna do something I did yesterday and try to act like I have a whiteboard here. Imagine for a second, you've got your small intestine, right? And it's this kind of like wall like this. So here's like on this side, this would be like your bloodstream, right? And here is like the inner intestine. Oh boy, come on. Right? So if you need nutrients to pass from here into here, right, that's not too hard to do. You know, there's some surface area. You would just basically need a series of holes in this and it would pass right through, right? Imagine this is like, I don't know, imagine it's like a screen door, right? Like it's kind of holy, water can pass through it for the most part, but like if too much stuff tries to get through all at once, it gets jammed up and it can't really pass from one side to the other. So luckily, this is not what your small intestine actually looks like. If you were to, like, let's say we like zoom in here, right? What you're gonna see is you're gonna see it actually kind of looks like this. It's a series of little tiny folds like this. All right, and then if you were to zoom in even further, you would see each of those individual holes have all of this hair lining them kind of like this. And so what that does is that increases the surface area. So now you're not just trying to get nutrients to pass from like a little tiny hole here into the other side. Now you're trying to get it to pass into this little hole and into that one and into that one and into that one. So there's a lot of little tiny areas for that to get into. That increases your surface area like nuts. So now you're able to absorb 1,000,000 times more nutrients than if it was just like a flat wall, right? Does that make sense, guys? I'm not sure how clear that was. Normally I get to draw this on a whiteboard, which is way easier. But let's take a look at small intestine absorption. Oh, there we go. That's the good stuff right there. All right. So you can see it's this big, long, like series of folds, right? And it kind of goes around, and eventually it becomes like your large intestine, which goes and goes this way, circles around and then out the body, right? So if you look at it, right, it's this kind of big tube. And if you look on that tube, there's all these little tiny folds here, right? Those folds are called lumen, by the way. But then see all like how the fold actually has little folds on them? Like you got folds on your folds. I heard you liked folds to go with your folds, so I got you some folds to go with your folds, right? Like whole bunch of friggin' tiny, tiny, tiny little folds. And then on each of those individual little folds, you can't really see it here, but there's also going to be all these little tiny hairs. And those hairs are actually there to kind of move nutrients around. Like, let's say you need to get like a carbohydrate, you need to get a sugar from down here up into the tube, right? Those hairs are actually able to kind of wiggle up that, that carbohydrate and get it to move where it needs to go until eventually it gets sucked in to your actual bloodstream. And there it is, right? You can actually see, these are so small. Look at these blood vessels traveling through here. So you can see, if we zoom in a little bit, you've got the red section. Those are blood vessels, like as it's like traveling, and that red stuff is actually supplying your small intestine with air and nutrients in order for it to survive. And then that blue part is actually where nutrients are being absorbed into your bloodstream, and then they're going to travel, and it's going to go through your liver, make sure that it's detoxified, and then eventually it'll travel throughout your body. If you need to get sugar down to your left big toe, well, it's going to go up through the liver, travel to the heart, and then get pushed down to your left big toe, and it will deliver that carbohydrate for you. So, and there's all those little tiny holes there. So this is called a villi or a villus, right? And so all of those little tiny folds, those are your villi. And then on your villi are all these little tiny hairs. Those are called your microvilli. And the microvilli are in charge of, like, pushing nutrients over to where they can actually get absorbed. And then also, do you see the green tubes in here? Those green tubes are part of your lymphatic system. That's actually delivering like fluids and things like that. That, thanks to all of that, that increases the surface area. That's what actually allows you to absorb nutrients. So in your small intestine, we need to get each of these little bits out of the way. So we need to understand that you have your intestinal villi, which are small, microscopic projections from the small intestine that are lined with blood vessels that are able to absorb chemicals and nutrients. Well, we'll just say nutrients. Chemical nutrients are chemicals. And then you have all of your little microvilli, which are small hair-like projections from your villi that move nutrients around. Okay, so each small intestine is all connected via the ileocecal sphincter. And eventually your small intestine goes all the way down to the very end, and you've got your ileocecal sphincter, which is the separator between your small intestine and your large intestine. And that's going to kind of separate. It's like food's not going to move into your large intestine unless it has been broken down. And by the way, you're only going to absorb the good nutrients. This is actually what's really awesome. So one cool thing about your small intestine, like, you guys got to understand how freaking small all of this stuff is, right? And now, one of the ways that I like to think of the digestive system is it absorbs nutrients. So let's talk about like aluminum, right? Aluminum, pretty freaking cool metal. It's light, it's hard, it's really great at like making a lot of really cool things. I got an aluminum cup here on my desk that's holding all my pens. We love aluminum, but aluminum is not a nutrient. It is not the type of metal that we eat in order to like maintain human life, right? But iron is, right? So iron is the type of nutrient that we absorb. Copper is a nutrient that we absorb. Manganese, molybdenum, which is my favorite one because that's such a silly name. All of those, but like things like silver is not an essential nutrient, although it has really cool properties when we do eat it. Gold is not an essential nutrient, also does some kind of cool stuff inside the body. Let's see here. Zinc, that's an essential nutrient. So, all right, so let's talk about like each of those essential nutrients, right? And then obviously we have our main essential nutrients, like our macronutrients, things like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, right? All of those things are absorbable by your small intestine. But what happens if you were to consume something that isn't food? Like let's say you got really excited. I don't know why this happened, but like you're having a Snickers bar and you were like, oh yeah, I'm so excited. And you accidentally swallowed some of the wrapper. And it came with it, right? So what's gonna happen is that plastic is gonna drop into your stomach. Now, your stomach is super acidic, right? So what's gonna happen to that plastic? What do you guys think? What's gonna happen to the plastic wrapper when it hits your stomach acid?
Oh, I don't know about what's in, well, is it kind of like the example that you gave with corn that it's just gonna go pass through you?
Oh my God, Nancy, you nailed it. I was looking for the wrong answer. That was great. That was supposed to be a trap. Wrong answers highlight highlight the right answer. You nailed it. Yeah, nothing's gonna happen to that wrapper because your body doesn't have the tools to break down plastic. It's not designed to break down plastic. It's designed to break down food. So, don't get me wrong, like if you were to drop, so if you drop a wrapper into hydrochloric acid isn't all that great at digesting plastics. But if you were to drop it into, let's say, like sulfuric acid, good God, I almost lost that word. If you were to drop it into like sulfuric acid, it would probably dissolve it, right? I think. I'm no expert on sulfuric acid. But that's actually what's kind of funny, by the way. We think of acids as being the stuff that's really good at like dissolving things, but ironically, water dissolves more stuff in this universe than any acid does. Water is the most dissolving substance in the universe. And that's because like it's really good at breaking down all the really simple stuff. So your body doesn't really have the tools to break that down. That's another reason why cats cannot taste glucose. They can't taste it because their body can't break it down. Glucose is actually not all that safe for your cat to eat, which is why there are no cat vegetarians ever. And that is not debatable. Sorry, man. Long story. So if you were to like absorb, like try to eat something that is not food, your small intestine certainly isn't going to be able to break it down because here's the thing, your stomach isn't going to break it down. So it's not going to get broken down all that much. But let's say somehow you eat something that's still not food, but maybe it does get broken down. Maybe you chewed it really well. Maybe the hydrochloric acid did have a small effect on it, so it did get really small. You don't really have the tools necessary to absorb it. I don't think, I like to not think of it as like tools. I like to think of it as like slots. Like you don't have the slots to absorb things that are not really foods, right? So I always picture this, and I know this is really kind of like a childish example, but at doctor's offices, how they always have that one toy for like babies that is like the square with the holes in it, and you're supposed to put the shapes through it. That is kind of how your digestive system kind of works. Like if you imagine carbohydrates as circles, proteins as squares, and fats as triangles, that's actually not a bad analogy. That's not really too far off from how your digestive system works. So if something does get into your small intestine that's not really designed to be absorbed, it doesn't really fit through the slot. For the most part, it's going to pass right through you. Which is one of the ways that we are actually able to test for certain materials in the body. So artificial sweeteners, for instance, right? Artificial sweeteners are kind of interesting. They're really cool little chemicals that are man-made that trick your taste buds into thinking that something is super sugary. Your brain goes, oh, that must be a sugar. It looks really similar on a chemical level to actual sugars, but it's not actually food. It's not actually a nutrient. So what ends up happening is once it's past your taste buds get fooled, but your digestive system's like, that's not food. And so for the most part, it just passes straight through you. And it comes out the other end uninterrupted. And that's going to lead me to one of my favorite videos. Now, this does not have too much to do with your digestive system, but it does have a lot to do with helping everybody understand how absorption actually works. So I'm gonna show you a really fun video here. This is by a guy named Mark Rober. And he was able to measure, well, not he, but like his, a friend of his, and then he decided to do a video on it. He did a really interesting video about how much pee you would find in the average swimming pool. We can actually calculate that pretty easily. So here's kind of a fun video.
Home is everything. These past few weeks, we've noticed everything we love about our
Hush.
Now that summer is winding down and you've already spent lots of time in the water, I want to show you now how to figure out how much pee is in any pool. There's actually a lot of misinformation on the topic of pee in pools, so I'm going to do some experiments on my own, along with some clever science people in foreign lands, and spoiler alert, some of the results are good news and some aren't. So let's jump right in. So this first experiment is to determine how much pee is in an actual sample of pool water using an ingenious method. So I got two samples from my friend's community pool where lots of people swim, one from the pool and one from the spa. And then two samples from a friend's backyard, again, one from the pool and one from the spa. I also collected samples from the source water at each location as a control, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now that I have my samples, I needed to quickly get to my scientist friend Lindsay in Canada. But lucky for me, I knew a shortcut.
He always does that cheesy joke.
We are now in the lab of the University of Alberta, and this is Lindsay Blackstock, and she is basically a genius. So you are going to help me determine how much pee is in these samples, because we know people pee in the pool.
Yes, we have strong evidence that people do pee in the pool. So we're going to try to find a way that we can measure that pee without actually measuring pee. I'm going to apply my new strategy based on the amount of artificial sweetener that's in the pool. We know artificial sweeteners don't come from anywhere except for urine. So that's the only logical source for them. If we find them in the pool and we know how much artificial sweetener is in the average person's pee, and then using that, we can estimate how much pee is in the pool.
Okay, so because artificial sweeteners are not actually food, yeah, you can taste them. They're good enough at tricking your taste buds, but they're not good enough at tricking your body into actually being absorbed. So for the most part, your body is going to go, that's not food, it's not going to absorb it, and it's going to pass straight through into your pee. And then if you pee in the pool, there will be sweet and low in that pool, and they're going to be able to test for it.
So we're going to take this sample, we're going to bring it over to our sample prep bench. We're going to filter it, transfer it into some special vials, into this instrument, which is a liquid chromatography system.
Of course.
So this instrument is going to concentrate our sample before it passes it on over to the second instrument, which is a mass spectrometer. And the mass spectrometer is able to detect the individual little artificial sweetener molecules one by one.
Love it. Let's get to work.
Bring it on over there.
Before we run the samples, let me explain why I find Lindsay the Scientist's solutions so brilliant. You can actually take a sample of pool water and directly measure the amount of urea in there. But the problem with that is humans also excrete urea through things like sweat, which is also very common in a pool. So you can't tell how much of that urea actually came from pee. To get around that, she looked at the amount of a certain artificial sweetener in the sample called asulfame potassium, which is really common in food products such as these, and also all of these. So pretty much everything. The reason drinks like these are 0 calories is because you taste the asulfame potassium sweetener, but the chemical compounds aren't broken down at all by your body. So more than 99% is passed through in your pee within 24 hours. And therefore, the only reason this would be in the pool is if it passed through a person first. And just to be sure, we measure the source water at both locations, because sometimes trace amounts of the sweetener can be found in the water supply. And if so, we just subtract that from the results. And I love this because we've all wondered how much pee is in a specific pool. But Lindsay figured out a really clever way to use proven science to actually answer the question.
All right, hold on. So kind of interesting, right? So like, yeah, they could just measure for urea. They could just measure for urine, but your sweat is actually very similar to urine. And so that wouldn't be the answer we're looking for.
The mass spectrometer takes about an hour to get results. So while we were waiting, Lindsay told me something that really surprised me. Chlorine in pools is obviously really helpful because it breaks down harmful bacteria, viruses, and microbes that would be harmful or even potentially deadly to humans. However, there is one big downside, and that is it reacts with urine to create a byproduct called trichloramine.
So trichloramine is what's responsible for that chlorine smell that you might get when you enter into an indoor swimming facility. It's
But
also
if I can smell chlorine like straight out of the bottle, it has that chlorine smell.
yeah, but the smell that you smell in a pool is trichloramine. Like this is the compound responsible for that characteristic swimming pool smell.
If I look skeptical here, it's only because I was. So I devised an experiment of my own.
So Maggie, it looks like you've already kind of figured out where this is headed. But yeah, when you smell chlorine if you dip chlorine into water, no smell. Dip chlorine into water plus urine, pool smell.
See if this was really true. For the experiment, I got 2 5-gallon buckets and filled them with pure water. Then I added 4 times the recommended concentration of chlorine for that volume of water to both buckets. And then only in the bucket labeled B, I added just a little bit of P. And I let it sit for a couple days. All right, so it's been 3 days. So this is the moment of truth. So first thing I notice is visually they look the same. You can't tell one bucket from the other as far as color of water goes. So I'm going to start and smell this one first.
I love this.
So that doesn't smell like anything. That smells just like water, even though this has 4 times the recommended concentration of chlorine for this volume, which makes me nervous to smell this one. What? That is crazy. This smells like a pool, even though the only difference between these two is this has a little bit of pee in it. This is a nostalgic smell. This smells like summers and vacationing at hotels with pools and water parks. Turns out it was just pee. So with trichloramine, which again is what is produced when pee reacts with chlorine, was just that classic pool smell. That's not that big of a deal. But the problem is, it's kind of bad news for both your lungs and your eyes. When your eyes are really red after swimming for a while, that's actually because of the trichloramine from the pee, not the chlorine. Trichloramine also causes things like asthma.
Oh my gosh.
So asthma is more likely.
Yeah, did I ruin your guys' day?
That is so bad.
How many times I said, wow, that chlorine is strong, or wow, that smells really strong. Wow.
Yep. No,
or my eyes are burning. Like I always get that sense when you go to like hotel pools and your eyes are burning.
Yep.
Oh, that's so bad.
Yep. Yep. This guy's channel, by the way, is like one of my all-time favorites. He just did a video on like a squirrel obstacle course during quarantine here because he was just super bored. For the record, by the way, he used to be a NASA engineer. He actually worked on the Mars rover, but then he quit to make YouTube videos. But yeah, super bummer, right?
Yeah, that's crazy. I've seen his squirrel videos before too.
Yeah, it's great, right? I love it, man.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, he's a genius. Yeah.
All right, here we go. This will be the last little bit here.
Than any other high-level athlete, which now makes sense because Michael Phelps admitted to always peeing in the pool, and he says all his buddies do too. So be cool and don't pee in the pool. Now let's go see Lindsay's results. In Lindsay's research, she sampled 20 public swimming pools and 10 public hot tubs. The average concentration of sweetener for the pools was 470 nanograms per liter, and for the hot tubs was 2,247. So after running all of my samples, we found that here in my friend's backyard pool, they had a concentration of artificial sweetener of 69 nanograms per liter, which equates to just under a gallon of pee. which is actually much lower than the average. But that makes sense because this would see much less use than a public pool. Their spa had a higher concentration than the pool at 103, but since a spa contains much less volume, that equates to about this much pee. So far, not bad. And then in this public community pool, we had 27 nanograms per liter of artificial sweetener concentration, which for this volume is again a little bit less than a gallon. And the spa was higher at a concentration of 335, which is about this much for the volume of spa. So the concentration of artificial sweetener in this pool and spa is much, much lower than the averages Lindsay saw in the 30 samples she collected, which leads me to believe that the water has been completely replaced recently, which happens from time to time for various reasons. If this pool had the average concentrations reported by Lindsay, for these volumes, we would expect to see over a gallon of pee in the hot tub and about 13 gallons in the pool. If you want an estimate of the pee in your own pool, I came up with a simple equation after talking with Professor Ernest Blatchley of Purdue University, who mentioned that studies have found that swimmers introduce between 25 and 80 milliliters of urine per swim session. So you take the average number of swimmers that were in your pool per day during the summer, and then you multiply that by 1.2. That's how many gallons of pee are in your pool at the end of the summer. And if you think your friends and neighbors pee more than average, use 2 as the multiplier. And if you think they are more on the courteous side of the range, use 1/2 as the multiplier. As a general rule of thumb, though, public pools about this size will contain approximately 13 gallons of pee, and Olympic pools will contain, brace yourself, over 130 gallons. There are some caveats to these generalizations, so check out the link in the video description for published papers from both scientist Lindsay and Professor Blatchley. So in conclusion...
All right, so anyway, he's going to wrap it up. But
what is this?
I love showing that video because it really does kind of highlight, like, they wouldn't be able to test for any of this if it wasn't for the fact that, like, if it's not a nutrient, your body cannot absorb it. Now, that's not always 100% true, right? He did even say it in the video. He said like about 99% of it passes through. So what happens to that remaining 1%? Well, you know, if I were playing with that kid's toy that I mentioned earlier, right? And I wanted to get like a star through the circle hole, you know, I'm an adult. I could smash that thing through that hole if I wanted to. Or let's say like it had a broken corner, maybe it would be able to get in. So that is how sometimes artificial sweeteners do get into our bloodstream. Now, luckily, we've got defensive mechanisms for that, like your liver, which is going to hopefully detoxify and carry it right back to your kidneys, and then you'll pee it out, right? But sometimes it survives. Maybe sometimes it gets picked up by random tissues of the body, and now it's running around you, and it's not a nutrient. So what is your body going to do? Well, your body's going to do whatever it does to whatever it always does to something that it doesn't recognize or it doesn't know what to do with, and it's just going to kind of put like a clump of cells around it. It'll put it in a little bubble, and it'll usually store it in some fat. It'll just kind of put it in some fat tissue, store it right there, and kind of leave it there until the end of your life. So that's kind of where it hangs out. Not really all that big a deal, right? And honestly, it isn't. But this lump can sometimes then maybe start to multiply, and then you have like a lump of cells that really aren't doing anything, and that might lead to like a growth or a mass, which could end up becoming like a full-on tumor. And this is why artificial sweeteners have been linked to different types of cancers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the nutrition class when we start diving into vitamins and minerals, because luckily you can eat vitamins and minerals, which are really good at acting as like a buffer to kind of fight against that whole process that I just talked about. So should you drink artificial sweeteners? I mean, for the most part, guys, like if you have it every now and then, it's going to pass right through you. But it is, you know, 0.01% risk versus no risk. So generally, I tell people, like, try your best to avoid artificial sweeteners whenever you can. But if you have them, it's nothing to really panic over. All right, so that's kind of a fun little detour. I love showing that video because it's always just kind of interesting. It's like, you know, doesn't have any, you know, pee doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about today, but it is kind of just showing you about like how absorption works. Also, it's horrifying, so you'll never forget it. And like, I just moved into a place with a pool. And like, you know, whenever we invite somebody over, if my pool starts smelling afterwards, I'm gonna be like, hey, we need to have a conversation. Okay, so your small intestine is where a lot of absorption is going to take place. Now, I do want to also mention in the world of absorption here, and I know we haven't gotten to it just yet, but I do also want to mention your large intestine, which is an additional site of absorption where most water absorption takes place. Also primarily responsible for elimination. Right? So your large intestine is also where like the formation of your stool comes in. It's going to absorb all that water, compact everything together, and then it's going to exit out of the body. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at our accessory organs, right? So this is all very much still part of the digestive process, right? Like we've looked at digestion and we've looked at absorption. Your accessory organs are we're gonna put them in their own category, but this is still very much directly related to the ideas of like digestion. You know, these organs are making materials that make digesting stuff easier. So accessory organs. I'll kind of put it under it. We'll give it a little space and then I'll indicate its own little section here. So your liver is a really good example of this, right? So your liver is a really, really, really important organ. In fact, it's so important, if you were to lose half of it, it would actually grow back to its original shape for the most part. One of the coolest organs that you've got in your body. And so it has all these tiny, what we call hepatic lobules, make up each lobe of your liver, and they are like what we call like the functional liver cells. So we always draw your liver as like these little tiny lobules here, and they are just covered head to toe in blood vessels because blood needs to get into and out of the liver. Like material needs to run through your liver like crazy. Those are able to create this material called bile. So your liver is an accessory organ with many functions in the body, including the production of bile. And bile is a material that acts as a fat emulsifier, right? So emulsifiers are able to break fatty acids down into their individual components, making them small enough for absorption. So again, like I mentioned earlier, if you try to like wipe grease off of a pan using water, fat is what we call hydrophobic. It is afraid of water. It repels water. So you need to have bile in order to emulsify those fats. That breaks those fats into tiny, 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 tiny pieces. And so like your body is going to store it. It's this yellow greenish liquid, and it's stored in the form of like little bile salts, right? And so that's actually what's created by your liver. Now it's going to be stored in this little golf ball shaped organ. This little pear shaped organ called your gallbladder, right? It's a little bit larger than a golf ball. And so you've got your liver here and a little duct, and what will happen is it will store bile salts in here. And then whenever you have like a super fatty meal, like let's say you go to like, what's that place we're going this weekend? Or we're ordering from this weekend. Freaking hot chicken place. It's in North Hollywood. God, Dave's Hot Chicken, which is real greasy, right? Or if you get like KFC or something like that, right? Like that's a really, really, really fatty meal. Then your gallbladder will release those bile salts into your small intestine, and it will absorb your fats. So, you know, most of your proteins and carbs are being digested here, but your fats, they're primarily getting digested right here. And then it's going to move through the rest of your small intestine for absorption. Okay. So bile is going to be stalled in the gallbladder, which is a small pear-shaped organ attached to the liver that is responsible for storing the bile that was created by the liver. Okay, so your gallbladder stores it and secretes it. It is also responsible, secretes it into the small intestine. Now, again, if you were to have like gallbladder surgery and have this removed, they would basically just connect that duct straight there. And that's why you don't really have to have your gallbladder. No problem, Frankie. We'll see you soon. Yeah, it's a long one today. We'll see you on Monday, man.
Okay. See you guys Monday. Take it easy.
You too.
All right, everybody.
See ya.
Oh, the game. Oh, it's not over. I thought it was. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, not quite. We're getting there. This is one of our longest PowerPoints, like literally in the whole program. So then you've got your pancreas, right? Your pancreatic duct, right? That is also going to release things like pancreatic amylase. That's going to help further break down bile. There's going to be a little bit of like, it is actually going to make other materials as well. So gallbladder, little pear-shaped sac underneath the liver there. And it has like little walls that allow it to like squeeze and get those bile salts into the small intestine. So that is what we call emulsification, right? Emulsification is where bile salts aid in the digestion of fat globules by breaking them into smaller and smaller and smaller droplets. Emulsification. Oh, good. It's giving me the chemistry one. I was really worried that it was only going to show me like how you like emulsify foods, like when you're cooking. So if you were to like have like a cup of water, right, and you were to drop some oil into that water, the water would like fall to the floor and then it would raise up because it's less dense than water. But if you were to squirt some dish soap in there and then shake that jar up, the whole thing, it would break down those lipids so small that it would actually just kind of mix in with everything. That's actually, if you've ever made scrambled eggs, you are emulsifying those scrambled eggs. You are mixing the proteins in with the fats. That's why, like, you know, they're separated because there's like little walls that kind of keep them separated. But if you stir it like crazy, the fats start mixing with the proteins. And when you add like a little bit of salt to that, that actually makes that even easier, which is why good chefs will tell you never to add salt while you are like making your scrambled eggs until like it's already like cooking. Then you can add salt. Or so I have been told. Now, other things that are going to be created there as well, you've got gastrin. Gastrin is actually a really cool hormone that tells your stomach to make more hormones. Secretin, same concept. Secretin is going to stimulate your pancreas to release things like bicarbonate. And so here's your pancreas right here. Again, here's your small intestine. So your stomach would be kind of behind this, your pancreas would be in front, and then there's your small intestine right here. And that's going to create things like pancreatic amylase, which is going to further help you break down carbohydrates. It's going to make things, actually, hold on. Pancreas, I'm getting ahead of myself. An accessory organ responsible for creating enzymes that further break down fats and carbohydrates. Okay, so that should be a B. So your pancreatic amylase digests carbohydrates, particularly like glycogen. It splits glycogen into disaccharides. So one of the ways that like your liver stores carbohydrates is in the form of glycogen. So if it wants to release that into your bloodstream, pancreatic amylase can help with that. Or if you were to eat like a food that has glycogen in it, pancreatic amylase is going to break down that specific type of carb. Then you've also got pancreatic lipase, which is going to help break down fats, particularly triglycerides. And so like if you have a particularly like unhealthy fatty meal, your pancreatic lipase is really responsible for helping you break that down. All right, now lastly, we're going to talk about elimination, which really doesn't have much to do with us as trainers. So we're going to move through this lightning fast. So elimination is the process of getting all this stuff out of your body, and that's going to happen in your colon. So it includes the larger diameter of like your large intestine, your small intestine, and then like really is, you know, mostly your large intestine. And so there's all these different sections of your colon there. And basically it's going to travel down. Again, your large intestine is much greater in size, like width, than your small intestine because it's so muscular, but it's definitely not longer. Like your small intestine is like, I think it's like 5 or 6 times longer. I could be exaggerating, but it's definitely much larger than your actual large intestine. The large intestine is just wider. And so that's going to come all together. And its job is to basically absorb a lot of water. And then also, if any food didn't get broken down, there's also going to be a whole bunch of good bacteria in your large intestine. And that bacteria is there to actually eat any materials that survived the digestive process. And so that good bacteria is actually why you take things like probiotics. Probiotics are basically little bacteria pills, but they're the good types of bacteria that help you further break stuff down. Just in the same way that like you would add yeast to like bread that you're making, that gives the bacteria, that gives the bread bacteria, which then gives it something to like kind of consume and break down those sugars and allow you to actually make bread. Well, the same thing is true like in your large intestine. All that bacteria is going to break down anything that didn't get digested previously. And so that's actually what your appendix is. Let's see. Did you guys learn this in school when you were kids? We don't know what the appendix does. You know, like the appendix was kind of a mystery. When I was a kid, I was taught, they were like, you have this organ, we don't know what it does. And I was like, that's kind of cool, you know, and then like moved on. That's not necessarily true anymore. We kind of figured it out for the most part. The big theory that is kind of around nowadays is that your appendix acts as sort of like a USB stick for all of that bacteria. It's kind of like an external hard drive that holds on to that good bacteria. So if you ever get sick and throw up or, you know, have diarrhea and you lose it out the back end, that's basically where like bad bacteria or like a virus or some type of material got into your body and your immune system was like, what is that? Something's in, all right, everybody out. Like it's like a bouncer at a club. There was a fight and now everybody has to leave, right? Good nutrients, bad nutrients, everything. And so it just comes flying out of you. That is basically what happens when you get sick. Well, you just lost all of your good bacteria. Unfortunately, that stuff got kicked out of the club as well. And that stuff helps you digest things, you know? So you have your appendix there. Its job is to kind of restart those bacterial cultures. The appendix is basically like a backup copy of all of those bacteria, which is why you can get rid of it. That's another one you can have removed. You know, if you have your appendix removed, it's not really all that big a deal because you can always just take a probiotic and get your bacterial culture started back up again. But here's your large intestine, right? It's going to connect from your small intestine. It's going to make a little lap around the small intestine and then exit out of the body. All right, so that is really all the big stuff when it comes to the anatomy of our digestive system, right? Now, I'm just really going to quickly break down nutrition in the fastest way possible. So we're going to keep this really, really simple today. So when we talk about like understand this whole process, we went through this whole process, we need to understand like why we're actually talking about it. And that's where nutrition comes in. So nutrition is going to be defined as the means by which biologic organisms intake and absorb essential nutrients responsible for maintaining life. Okay, so nutrition is all of the processes by which we eat things that are that keep us alive, right? So your bones, they're made of a little bit of like phosphorus and calcium, right? Calcium primarily. And so you need to make sure that calcium is a part of your diet. And so like when we think of calcium, we think of, you know, like this kind of white powdery material, you know, it's found in milk and things like that. But this is actually what calcium looks like. It's a metal. It's a metal that looks just like any other metal. That's calcium in its totally raw, natural form. So, you know, all of these things are actually metals. So we kind of want to think of metals a little bit differently than you might have been thinking of them in the past. They are totally essential. You've also got things like vitamins. Vitamins are these little chemicals that aid in metabolic processes. So we need to be able to eat those different chemicals, those different elements, in order for us to be able to use our body. It allows our cells to be able to do their jobs, right? So nutrition is the study of nutrients and how the body uses them. I'll actually put that definition down here as well. So it's the study of nutrients and how the body uses them, right? What are nutrients? Nutrients are, actually I'm going to change that ever so slightly. There are going to be 6 essential nutrients, okay? Now, in the world of biology, you've probably heard me say this before, but I want everybody to remember this. If you ever see the word essential, what that means is that it is essential you get it, okay? It is necessary that you get it somehow. It is essential that you eat them, right? Silver, not an essential nutrient. Copper, totally an essential nutrient, right? Copper is really important for your immune system to be able to function. Zinc is really important for your immune system to function. Actually, zinc, the reason you take it when you're sick, it doesn't necessarily make your immune system any stronger, but what zinc does is it's actually how your immune cells tag viruses and bacteria. So you've got these like little immune cells running throughout your body, and what they'll do is they'll go by like a virus and they'll stab it, and they'll leave a little bit of zinc in there, and that marks it for destruction. And so then the other part of your immune system comes by and it's like, can't help but notice you got a little bit of zinc on you, and it's like, oh my God, it eats it, which is really cool. So if you want to give it ammunition, you got to make sure you get some zinc while you're sick. So your 6 essential nutrients are going to be carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Those are the first 3. Those are what we call macronutrients. They're called macro because you need a lot of them. You need large amounts of them. And then you've got your micronutrients, which are going to be vitamins and minerals. And those are micronutrients because you need very trace amounts of them. And then you've got your most essential nutrient of all, which is water. Water is the most important nutrient because, again, it allows us to do hydrolysis. You cannot have a metabolism without water. So let's go ahead and break these down really quick. So your macronutrients are nutrients needed in very large quantities, okay? These are going to be carbohydrates, which we are going to define as complex chains of sugar molecules, okay? Complex chains of glucose. You got a couple different versions. You've got mono, for one, saccharides. You've got disaccharides, and you've got polysaccharides. Well, we'll get into that in just a little bit. Then you've got proteins, which are complex chains of amino acids. And you've got fats, which are complex chains of fatty acids, okay? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about proteins, fats, and carbs. They are macronutrients. When you hear somebody say, like, you know, you got to get your macros in line, that's what they're talking about. Then we got our micronutrients, which are nutrients needed in small quantities that aid in metabolic processes and give the body form. So like, you know, this gives your body actual, like calcium, for instance, is what makes up your skeletal system. So it's really necessary to make sure that it's like a part of your diet. It gives your body structure. It gives your body form. We'll say structure, actually. But at the same time, you've got vitamins, which also aid in the process of like the Krebs cycle, for instance. Like all your B vitamins assist in the Krebs cycle, and all your vitamins A, D, E, and K, they act as like, antioxidants, and they help aid in other metabolic processes. A lot of vitamins actually aid in the uptake of things like calcium. They aid in the uptake of minerals. So minerals are going to be inorganic elements that make up some body structures and aid in metabolism. So yeah, that's fine. So for instance, like sodium and potassium, right? They aid in like creating electricity within your body. That's how you create action potentials. And that's how you can get something from your nervous system to your muscular system. And then we got vitamins. And vitamins are small compounds that assist in the metabolic processes within the body and aid in the utilization of some minerals. So your body is able to more effectively use things thanks to vitamins. They sort of act similarly to enzymes. And then our last nutrient is water. And water is the most essential nutrient. It is responsible for cooling the body, aiding in metabolism, and providing the movement of materials throughout the body. Okay, so you also are able to move things around thanks to water that can carry nutrients from point A to point B. So those are your 6 essential nutrients: carbs, proteins, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. Now, one of the other parts of like nutrition that we are obviously going to spend a whole bunch of time talking about is calories. And now calories, I always like to say this, but calories are technically something that doesn't exist. At least it's not something that you can physically hold. It's like an inch or a second or a mile or a degree. You know, it's a unit of measurement. It's not actually like a physical thing. Like there's no such thing as an inch. It's just something that we made up to kind of help understand our world, right? You can't hold an inch. Well, the same thing is true of calories. Calories are what we use to measure the amount of energy held within a food. So a calorie is a unit, are units of measurement used to determine the amount of energy held within foods. Okay, so that's what a calorie is. Now, I gotta apologize right here for all of the world of science because I'm the one who has to teach it. But there is actually a difference between a lowercase calorie and an uppercase calorie, which totally sucks because like it's something that is very easy to miss. But the calorie that we all are kind of familiar with every day is technically actually 1,000 calories. Technically, like when we talk about like the calorie that we see, like when something says 200 calories on it, it's actually 200,000 calories that are in it. It's just that that number is so large, we decided to create the uppercase version. The uppercase version is equal to 1,000 little case versions. And so what a calorie actually is, typically we refer to that as a kilocalorie. But what a lowercase calorie is, and it's gonna automatically uppercase that for me, is lowercase c, is the amount of energy held within food to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So what's kind of cool is like the way calories work is you're actually going to like let's say I have like a thing like a cup of water, right? And I took a hamburger and I put it underneath that cup of water and I lit that hamburger on fire. That water is going to start to heat up and eventually it's going to start to maybe boil even depending on how hot it gets. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have like I'm going to have like a thermometer inside that water. And so let's say I had 1 kilogram of water inside there, so that's 1,000 grams of water, right? And so like what happens is, let's say that temperature raises by, let's say 220 degrees, right? So the water goes from being room temperature and it raises up 220 more degrees, there are 220 calories inside of that hamburger. That's how we're able to measure calories. And there are 3,500 calories in 1 pound of fat. So if you want to know how much weight or how many calories you need to lose in order to lose a pound of fat, it's equal to roughly about 3,500 calories worth. So it's the amount of energy to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So I used 1,000 grams of water. It raised by, like I said, 200 degrees or whatever I said. That means there's 200 calories inside that burger, which actually means there's 200,000 of these little calories. Oh yeah, Celsius is uppercase. So the calorie with uppercase C is sometimes referred to as a kilocalorie, because kilo means 1,000. It is 1,000 of the lowercase calories. That's usually the one we're actually referring to. This is normally see on nutrition labels. But if you go to other countries, you'll notice that it usually says kilocalories, because that is a much easier way to be clear. All right. So talking about calories, if we talk about like carbohydrates, we actually know how much energy is held within 1 gram of carbohydrates. And the amount of energy held within a gram of carbohydrates is going to be about 4 calories. So for every gram, like let's say you took a gram of carbs, right? Now, I'm not saying like a gram of crackers, right? I mean like the carb, because that cracker has like proteins in it, has fats in it, right? I'm just talking about the carbohydrate portion. So if you pull all the sugars out of that cracker and you're left with only the sugars, which are only the carbohydrates, and you were to measure how much energy is in there, for every gram, you're gonna have about 4 calories, okay? So 1 gram of carbohydrates is equal to 4 calories. And the same thing is true of proteins. 1 gram of protein is also equal to 4 calories, which is kind of funny, right? Because everybody's always like, oh, carbs are bad, right? Carbs aren't bad. They're just way easier to stack more grams in a much smaller space. Also, sugar tends to raise your blood sugar, has a bunch of other bad effects. So sugar is bad. Carbs are good, right? Even though sugars are an example of a carb. Protein, 4 calories per gram. Fat, though, 9 calories per gram. So there's actually a lot of energy held within fat. This is why I was saying your aerobic metabolism, you could essentially do it forever because we have so much fat stored on our body. Even if you have a really low body fat percentage, you have an unlimited energy supply. So like I mentioned earlier, carbohydrates are going to be these complex chains of sugar molecules. They're going to include things like sugars and other starches. Most of your energy in terms of your diet should be coming from carbohydrates. About 45 to 65% of your energy per day should be coming from carbohydrates. So those are going to be in the forms of grains, vegetables, glycogen found in meats, although that's a very, very small amount. And then disaccharides and monosaccharides, AKA sugars, you know, things like honey or just straight up table sugar. Then you got lipids. Lipids are basically fat-like substances, or they are fat substances, and they are going to supply you with energy and then also give your body structure. You know, all of your cells have fat in them, every single one of them. That's actually what makes up the walls of your cell, and that's what keeps water from getting in there and destroying them. But also things like cholesterols and phospholipids, those are really common. We usually just refer to lipids as fats within our diet. The most common version is going to be triglycerides, which are basically fatty molecules that have like 3 little tails on them. So it's 3 fatty acids attached together. That's what a triglyceride is. Now there's a couple, the most common versions are going to be your saturated and unsaturated fats. You've got monounsaturated fats, which are fats that have like 1 space available. You got polyunsaturated fats, which are fats that have 2 spaces available. And you've got saturated fats, which are saturated, therefore they have 0 spaces available. So saturated fats are really good. They're at stacking themselves together. They're really dense because there's no space, right? Whereas like unsaturated fats have kinks in them. That's where you get that little gap. That's where you get the space. And that's why unsaturated fats are like oils. They're liquid at room temperature because of how like undense they are. They're all kinked up. So there's more space, which means they can't stack and form a solid. Whereas saturated fats like butter is solid at room temperature. It's able to be solid because it's able to stack itself so efficiently. Then you might have noticed I haven't mentioned trans fats. Trans fats are the devil. They are a completely man-made fat. They do not exist in nature. It is what you get from superheating the unsaturated fats. And so you take that thing that had some space available, and then through heat, you straighten it out, and it starts to act as a really evil fat. And it actually destroys your good fats. So if you think of good fats and bad fats, saturated fat's the bad fat, unsaturated fat's the good fat, and then trans fats are really bad fats. Like saturated fats are bad for you. Trans fats are straight up deadly. I am not a big fan of telling people to avoid stuff when it comes to their diets. I don't like telling people what not to eat. I like to tell people what to eat. However, the exception to that rule is trans fats. Avoid that thing like the plague because they are a plague. All right, then you get your fatty acids, right? You've got like your omega-3s and your omega-6s. They're really important because they give your body certain abilities to produce metabolism as well. So like for instance, omega-3s are really important for cell wall production. Omega-6s are also really important for like cholesterol production. Those are your fatty acids. And then you've also got your cholesterols, which are like proteins attached to fats. Those are what we call lipoproteins. And that's how you make hormones, actually. So lipoproteins are really important. You need cholesterol in order to synthesize things like testosterone and estrogen and things like that. So cholesterol is a super important part of our diet, even though most people have too much of it, which then starts, living in your blood vessels and raises your blood pressure and is very bad for you. Then, like I said, you get your proteins. Your proteins are these big complex chains of amino acids, right? They include things like enzymes, your muscles, obviously, other hormones. You do have protein-based hormones as well. And even your immune system is made up of proteins, right? It's running around killing foreign invaders. So after digestion kind of breaks those proteins down, you are left with individual amino acids, which your body can then reassemble into the U-shaped version, right? So the two types of proteins that you're going to find are what we call complete proteins and incomplete proteins. So a complete protein is basically a protein that has all of the amino acids present in it, and an incomplete protein is missing one or more of those essential amino acids, okay? So like all animal proteins will have every amino acid, because if you think about it, it's like, oh, an animal ate food, assembled those proteins into, assembled those amino acids into a protein. That's why it's a complete protein, because animal stuff has to have all of the ingredients. But plants can be missing one or two of the amino acids and still be totally healthy, right? So like corn or spinach or peas or anything like that, right? All of those have like fairly good levels of protein in them, but they are missing a few amino acids. So if you were to only eat corn as like your entire source of protein, you wouldn't be able to make proteins in your body because you'd be missing an ingredient or two. And that is where like the idea of essential proteins come in. Are essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are the ones that your body cannot make, so it is essential that you consume them. Now, you've also got your vitamins and your mineral. Oh, wait, real quick. I want to do an example. So that might lead people to believe that you have to be a carnivore. You have to have like some like animal protein in your diet. That's not necessarily true, by the way. You can absolutely create a complete protein by pairing two incomplete proteins. Beans and rice is the perfect example of that. Beans, they're missing a few amino acids. Rice, it's missing a few amino acids. But when you eat them together, it gives you all the amino acids. So it'd be the same as eating like a piece of steak. There are a few plants out there that do have complete proteins. Quinoa is a really good example. That actually is a complete protein, even though it's a plant. And soybeans. That's where like tofu and things like that come from. Then you've also got vitamins. Vitamins are organic compounds that help you with metabolism. You've got vitamins A, D, E, and K. Those are what we call fat-soluble vitamins. Fat is responsible for breaking them down and carrying them throughout the body. So if you don't have any fat in your diet, it could actually make you vitamin deficient. And then you have your water-soluble vitamins, which are vitamin C and your entire B complex. So the entire group of all the B vitamins, B6, B12, B2, B4, all those. Those are all water-soluble. So they are carried around thanks to water. So you can become vitamin deficient if you don't get enough water. Or actually, if you drink too much water, weirdly enough, that can actually pull them out as well. Sources are, things like for vitamin A, you're going to get them from things like livers, fishes, whole milks, and butter. There's a big list here. I'm actually not going to go through each of these because we're going to cover more of this in nutrition rather than our physiology class. But they're mentioned here. So here's some really good examples of fat-soluble vitamins. Here's some really good examples of your water-soluble vitamins. These are usually, for the B complex, usually found in proteins, particularly B6 and B12, which are two things like if you are a vegan, that is totally fine, but sometimes you have to take a B6 and a B12 supplement because those can really only be found in meats. Then you get vitamin C. That's kind of what you think of when you think of your immune system. Citrus fruits, tomatoes, potatoes, things like that. Minerals, you got two different major categories here. These are going to be inorganic compounds. Things like iron, calcium, chlorine, the stuff you put in pools and clean your house with, is an essential nutrient. However, it is what is called a micronutrient. I'm sorry, a trace mineral. And that means that you need very little amounts of it. But it is important. That's actually how you make some of your hydrochloric acid. Potassium, sodium, sulfur. That's always kind of a surprising one, right? Sulfur, the friggin' stuff that explodes. Totally an important part of your diet. Chromium, cobalt, copper, fluorine, iodine, manganese, selenium, and zinc, right? All those are also really important nutrients. So as we get older, obviously all that stuff starts to break down. We're not too worried about that. But in the end, right, like I said, this PowerPoint moves fast at the end. Digestion is going to break. What I want you guys to remember, digestion breaks stuff down, and then your digestive system is also responsible for absorbing it. Absorption is the process of allowing nutrients to pass into your bloodstream. Digestion is the process of making stuff real small. And we do it in order to get all of these individual little pieces here. So the last little thing I do want to put in here, just because I think if I remember right, it shows up on your homework. I want to modify these nutrients notes really quick. You're going to see this version of notes a lot. Carbohydrates, complex chains of sugar. Proteins, you have got amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, right? And then you've got complete proteins, which contain all essential amino acids, and incomplete proteins, which are, oh my God, missing one or more essential amino acids. So I wanted to get that down there. Whew! 73 slides, up and down. Biggest one you guys have had to deal with yet.
Yep.
Pretty crazy, right? But we did it in, a relatively good time. We got it through in like what, hour and a half, hour 45? Not too bad. All right. So you guys have survived and made it to your weekend. Congratulations. I'm going to get number one up on Canvas today. It'll be 15 questions related to everything we talked about today and yesterday. It'll have a little bit of energy system stuff in it, but not too much, if I remember right. Don't worry about knowing like ATP synthase or acetyl-CoA. Like that stuff, we'll get into that way later. Just remember anaerobic versus aerobic, right? With oxygen, without oxygen, with oxygen. And then from yesterday, remember like metabolism is all of it. Anabolism is building it up. Catabolism is breaking it down. And then all the basic stuff of today, digestion versus absorption, and your 3 main macronutrients. You get that? You guys, you got any questions?
No. I'm just gonna have to definitely view this again because it's a lot of information.
Yeah, this is the most repetitive mod, by the way, because it is a lot of information. It's just a lot of terminology. It's just a lot of labeling. So we're just going to introduce the terms a whole bunch. It'll make sense. It'll like, because it's like right now you're probably actually understanding the concepts pretty well, but you're having like you can. Like, I just think of it as like I know the story, but I don't know any of the words to the story. Like I know there's a hero triumphant somewhere, you know, like, but I cannot for the life of me remember what his name is or if he was using a sword or a bow and arrow, you know, like, so those details, and it's like, oh, okay, and then like you reintroduce it and you're like, that's right, his name was Bob, you know. That's kind of what learning physiology is like. It's like you get the process, but like all those terms and like which thing does which process, that will fall into place slowly as we start to repeat it. So, all right. I'll see you ladies on Monday.
Thank you, Brad.
Bye.
See you later. Oh, come on, end button.